Good afternoon. My name is Roger Sharp in the History Department in Maxwell. I'm pinch hitting today for Bob McClure, who was supposed to introduce Matt, but I was delighted to come in a pinch hitting role. I've known Matt Bennett for a number of years. He's the son, as many of you know, of David Bennett, a longtime member of the History Department, my colleague and Matt's father. So I've gotten over the years to be able to follow Matt's career through David with our daily talks, and Matt has done this or done that, and I've got to say that his public service career since he left school has been absolutely outstanding, a model I think that many of us would hope to emulate, but few would achieve. So it's my great pleasure to introduce an old friend of mine and Matt Bennett, and hear what he has to say. Matt is the Senior Vice President for Public Affairs and the co-founder of Third Way. He was in the Clinton White House as Deputy Assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs. He was in the office of Vice President Al Gore. As a matter of fact, I think, weren't you in the limo with Al Gore and convinced him not to concede early?
I was in the motorcade.
Okay. In 2001 to 4, Matt was Director of Public Affairs for Americans for Gun Safety, which later became part of Third Way. Matt appears frequently on TV and radio. Probably some of you have seen, I certainly have, and frequently quoted in the New York Times and the Washington Post. He's been on 60 Minutes, Today, Good Morning America, Meet the Press, NPR, and all major cable political programs, including Fox, right? Yeah. After the tragedy at Sandy Hook, Matt worked with the victims' families of that community to help them understand the harsh reality of gun politics. And he recently authored a long article that I was able to read this morning, which is I enthusiastically recommended to you. It was really an outstanding piece entitled "The Promise, the Sandy Hook Families and a Long Road to Gun Safety." And this came out of that experience he had with meeting with these parents from Sandy Hook. Today's topic is the politics of guns, and I think that looking over Matt's resume and seeing what he's done, that few in the United States, in fact, I would say no one in the United States, has as much knowledge on the politics of gun regulation as Matt. So welcome, Matt.
It is a thrill to be introduced by people that I grew up viewing as living legends like Roger, and to have joining us friends of both of my parents. So thank you all for coming. When you meet with the parents of nearly a dozen very recently murdered 6-year-olds, the greetings alone are almost unbearable. I'm Nelba. My daughter's name is Anna. She was 6. I'm Mark. My son's name is Daniel. He was 7. I'm Nicole. My son's name is Dylan. He is 6. That was my introduction to the families of Sandy Hook. It was early February of this year. The massacre at the elementary school that took the lives of 20 kids and 6 adults had happened on December 14th. So this was just about 6 weeks later. 11 of the families had somehow summoned the courage to come to Washington. And they were there to meet privately with Vice President Biden and with a number of senators, but they were not just there to get very high-level condolences. They were there with the express purpose of wading into some of the toughest waters in American politics, which is the gun debate. And I was there to help them navigate some of those waters. As Roger mentioned, I've worked in the gun debate on and off for about 13 years. And at the time that I did this meeting with the Sandy Hook folks, my organization and I were working with the White House and congressional Democrats to craft a legislative response to the Sandy Hook tragedy, because it appeared that for a moment there was going to be a break in the politics of guns. I was brought in to talk to a group called Sandy Hook Promise that sprang up in the wake of the tragedy. It was founded in the kitchen of the home of another family in Newtown. And it was just a number of grief-stricken friends and family members who were wanting to do something. And I have been honored to work with these brave people ever since then. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about that experience in the context of three things. One, gun policy. What gun policy do we have and what do we need? Two, the politics of guns and what that means for any progress at the federal level. And third, just a bit on the Sandy Hook massacre and whether that has really changed anything. I'm going to focus on federal gun law. Just to be clear, many states, including New York, have pretty robust laws of their own, but my job has been to focus on the federal laws. So first, let's take a look at gun policy. Before the 1960s, we basically had no federal gun laws. To buy a gun in many states was the same as to buy a hammer. You would simply walk into a store, you would pick out your model, you would pay for it, and you would leave. There were no questions asked, there were no rules. Anyone could buy a gun. After the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Congress passed the 1968 Gun Control Act. And that basically did two things. It created several classes of people who were prohibited from possessing guns. Anyone who had been convicted of a felony of any kind, undocumented immigrants, anyone dishonorably discharged from the military. That was a category that was added because Lee Harvey Oswald had been dishonorably discharged. And there were other categories, including one for mental illness. That class, even today, still has kind of a 1960s era flavor to it. It's a bit balky. The mental health prohibitions apply only to those who have been involuntarily committed to a mental institution or have been adjudicated mentally ill by a court. No other mental illness provisions apply under federal law. And in later years, domestic abusers, anyone convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic abuse or under a restraining order is prohibited from owning a gun. That act in 1968 also created a class of people who were deemed to be in the business of selling guns, and they needed a federal license. Now, this is pretty unusual. The federal government doesn't license very much, but it was determined that they would license gun dealers. And there were a couple of rules that applied just to federal firearms licensees, FFLs. And one rule was that they can't sell handguns to anyone under 21. But other than that, that was it between 1968 and 1993. And as you probably can gather, there was kind of a central flaw in the 1968 Gun Control Act, which was that it was based on the honor system. There's no way to check. You could go into a gun store, assert that you were not a felon, not an undocumented immigrant, not dishonorably discharged, and you could get your gun. There was no check or balance on this. It was easier to buy a gun as a felon than it was to buy beer as a minor. And that was true until 1993. So what happened? When Clinton ran for president, one of the fundamental questions was how were we going to deal with the crime epidemic? The crack cocaine wars in major cities was fueling a horrible rise in the crime rate, and much of that involved guns. So one of his central promises was that he would pass at long last what was being called the Brady Bill. It was named, of course, after Jim Brady, who had been injured in the assassination attempt on President Reagan. He and his wife, Sarah, had become advocates for tightening up our gun laws. And remember that the assassination attack was 1981. It took 12 years to pass and sign into law the Brady Bill. And what the Brady Act did was created a system so that people could be checked to see if they fell into one of the prohibited classes. Now, the initial mechanism for doing that has changed. There was a waiting period. That was ended after 5 years, but that was mostly because we needed time to get the system into place. And by the way, the internet was still kind of in its infancy. But the way it works now is quite simple. If you go to buy a gun from a federally licensed dealer, they run a background check, and it's instant. It's actually called the National Instant Check System. It takes, on average, 90 seconds to complete this. The gun dealer will call a 800 number, talk to somebody with the FBI, or in some states, the state police. They'll put your name into the database. If you pass, you buy your gun. If you don't pass, you don't buy your gun. Since 1998, when the instant check system went into place, 5 years after Brady, more than 2 million people have been stopped from purchasing firearms at federally licensed dealers. But think about this. There's some self-selection going on here. Most of the time, if you're a felon, you're not going to submit yourself to a background check. And yet, despite that self-selection, 2 million people have been prohibited from buying guns. So the Brady Act is working pretty well. After the Brady Act was passed in 1993, then Senator Biden and then Congressman Schumer muscled through a provision of a broader crime bill that was passed in 1994 that would prohibit the sale of certain kinds of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. And that was it. There had been no other significant federal gun laws passed in this country with the exception of those three. Now, both of these bills, the Brady Act and the assault weapons ban, were very significant, but both of them had pretty big flaws that were kind of engineered into them, some intentionally and some not. Brady, of course, added teeth to the 1968 Act by requiring that you go through a background check, and it's achieved much of that purpose, as I said, but there's still some problems. The data that is used to do the background checks is spotty. There's mostly, if you're a felon, you're in the system, but if you fall into a mental health category, you may not be. For example, the state of Oklahoma currently has 3 names in the system under the mental health category. And I've been to Oklahoma. It is not that sane. There are more than 3 people who should not have guns because of reasons of mental health in Oklahoma. So the data vary, but they're starting to get their act together. Congress has provided some incentive for states to do a better job of getting their data in the system, and that's starting to be addressed. The biggest problem is that while the 1968 Act applies to everyone, it is illegal under any circumstances for a felon or other prohibited class to have a gun, the Brady Act doesn't. So it is not necessary for anyone to go through a background check unless they buy their gun from an FFL, a federally licensed dealer. And to be clear, there are a lot of FFLs. There are 59,000 federally licensed gun dealers. That is 5 times the number of McDonald's in the United States. So there are plenty of gun dealers. Many of them are gun stores. Some of them are running out of their home. Some of them don't even sell guns, but they just have a license. But there are a lot of gun dealers. The problem is, of course, that many people buy their guns from unlicensed sellers. And they do that mostly at gun shows or through the internet. Now, of course, there are people that buy their guns when they see them advertised on a bulletin board or at a church bazaar. That does happen. There are people that buy their guns from their relatives. Of course, that happens too. But the vast majority of gun sales that go on outside of the licensed dealer context are between strangers. They're essentially business transactions, arm's length, and those are facilitated at gun shows and on the internet. Just go to a gun show in any one of the 33 states that haven't closed the gun show loophole on their own. Pennsylvania is one. They happen every single weekend. There are, in many cases, thousands of vendors. Many of the vendors are licensed dealers. They'll have a big sign that says Joe's Guns. They'll have their guns laid out, every variety. If you buy a gun from Joe's Guns, they run you through a 2-minute background check, and you go on your way. Right next to Joe's Guns at these gun shows is a table with a sign, in many cases, that says, no questions asked. That's the unlicensed seller. They might have the exact same array of wares. So you don't have to be a genius to figure out where the criminals are buying their guns. You can actually see this. I've been to gun shows in Richmond, Virginia, where there are people wearing gang colors buying guns from unlicensed sellers right out in the open. Then there's the internet. And this, we knew about the gun show loophole. It came to light really after the Columbine tragedy in 1999 because some of the guns used there were bought from unlicensed sellers at gun shows. The internet has come on as a problem much more recently. And there is a site on the internet called armslist.com. Now, to buy a gun on the internet, even from an unlicensed seller, you have to do it, to be legal, you have to do it inside your own state. Crossing state lines with a gun, unless you're a licensed dealer, is illegal. But Arms List divides, it's a Craigslist for guns, and it's divided by state. If you look at Arms List, you will be stunned. The New York Times, a few months ago, took a look at the site, and they found 170,000 guns for sale during their 3-month investigation. 94% of the ads were posted by private sellers, that is, non-FFLs, meaning very easy pickings for prohibited buyers to do their shopping online. And the Times didn't have to win any Pulitzers for finding felons and domestic abusers both buying and selling guns on armslist.com. My organization, Third Way, took a look at Arms List, and let me just give you the data we found for one state, the state of Ohio, not an outlier, very typical. In the state of Ohio, in the month of June of this year, there were 1,840 ads for semi-automatic weapons for sale. 941 ads for buyers seeking private sellers, and 225 ads of people selling 4 or more guns as private sellers. Again, where would you go if you were a criminal to find your guns? And it's not just garden variety criminals that are looking at these places. In 2001, there was a Hezbollah agent named Ali Boumelhem who went to a gun show in Michigan. He bought 4 upper receivers for AR-15s, which is the gun part. He brought them, he was tracked back to his auto parts shop where he packed these into auto parts supplies and attempted to ship them to Lebanon. In 2011, Al-Qaeda posted a video by their American-born spokesman, Adam Gadon, noting how easy it is to buy a gun without a background check in the US. I'm quoting the Al-Qaeda video. You can go down to a gun show at the local convention center and come away with a fully automatic assault rifle without a background check, and most likely without having to show any ID. So what are you waiting for? That's Al-Qaeda. So that's the gun show and internet loophole, and that's the big problem with the Brady Act. What about the assault weapons ban? Well, the biggest problem with the assault weapons ban was actually intentional, and that is that it expired in 2004. The expectation of its authors, Schumer and Biden, was that it would be renewed, but it wasn't, and it isn't coming back. And it isn't coming back for some reasons that are both political and substantive. Substantively, it's important to understand what an assault rifle is. Modern guns, almost all of them, are semi-automatic. That is, they use a removable magazine, they fire on the pull of a trigger, they don't have, a cylinder, and they are not fully automatic. Those are illegal in almost all cases for civilians. They're not machine guns, but they fire quite easily with the pull of a trigger. And every gun for sale now, with the exception of some shotguns, almost all of them are semi-automatics. The difference with assault rifles is that there's a huge variance in size and shape, in lethality, in speed, and accuracy among firearms. And in the 1980s, some of these very lethal, very accurate weapons started showing up on American streets and began to pick up the name assault weapon. The gun industry prefers the title modern sporting rifle. The assault weapons ban was born of a concern raised by the police in major cities because they were being outgunned. They simply didn't have the firepower to deal with these gangs who had Uzis and MAC-10s when they were using old-style Smith & Wessons. And as the civilian and police casualties mounted, there was an effort to ban these guns. In order to get it across the finish line in Congress, though, even with a Democratic Congress at the time in 1994, Schumer and Biden had to make a bunch of concessions. One was that it would expire. The second was that it would be limited to 18 explicit named brands of firearms, Uzis, MAC-10s, and a few others, and any firearm that had 2 or more characteristics that made it kind of look or act like a weapon of war. The problem is that some of these characteristics were like bayonet mounts. You don't see a ton of bayonets around in civilian life. And so it wasn't a huge problem for gun makers to not include a bayonet mount or a grenade launcher on their gun. If they avoided adding these things, they could make a firearm. And by the way, all of the assault weapons that were already on the streets were grandfathered in. So the assault weapons ban of 1994 had probably a relatively minimal impact on gun crime. Criminologists differ on this somewhat, but there were a ton of legal assault weapons in circulation in the 10 years the law was in effect, and there's even more now that it isn't. One of the other aspects of the assault weapons ban that was relevant to the recent debate is that it banned high-capacity magazines or clips. Anything with more than 10 rounds was banned. The problem is it grandfathered in all the old ones. And the initial focus of the folks from Sandy Hook was not only an assault rifle, but also on high magazine clips. Adam Lanza was armed that day with 2 pistols, but his main weapon was a Bushmaster 223. It's an AR-15 assault rifle. It looks exactly like what you would imagine a soldier carrying, because it is exactly like what a soldier would carry, almost exactly. He had 30-round high-capacity magazines and, he had 10 30-round magazines, so 300 rounds in the 30-round clips, and he had 20 20-round magazines. That's 700 bullets. That was enough to kill everyone in the school had he kept going. He ended up firing 154 rounds in 4 minutes. In the brief interval when he stopped shooting to change cartridges, 6 children escaped. Had he been forced to reload 16 times rather than 6 times, as he would if he was using a standard-sized magazine, the parents of Sandy Hook that I talked to believe that many of their children would be alive. So you can imagine when they came to Washington, they were pretty intent on reimposing a ban on high-capacity magazines. But I had to tell them that day, and I knew this even in February, that that wasn't going to happen, that there wasn't going to be a renewed ban on assault weapons or on high-capacity magazines. There simply was no way that the Senate would take it up, and the House wouldn't even consider it. I had to tell them also that the very things that were at the heart of the tragedy that had torn apart their lives couldn't be addressed because of the politics of guns. And one of the things that has made Sandy Hook promise a very different kind of new on-the-scene gun safety group is that they said to me, okay, we understand that that can't be done, at least not in the short term. What can we do? What can we accomplish that would make things better? And this was very much like the way the 9/11 families, at least many of them, conducted themselves. What they said was, we understand that many of the fixes that we're proposing after 9/11 wouldn't have stopped Mohammed Atta, but it will make America safer, and therefore we want to do it to honor the memory of our loved ones. And that is what the Sandy Hook parents did, and what they got behind was a provision to close the gun show and internet loopholes. So why do we need to do this? A couple of statistics. Every year in the United States, there are 31,000 gun deaths. It's about 11,400 murders, 19,000 suicides, by far the biggest cause of death with guns, and 600 accidental shooting deaths. We have more than 10 firearm deaths per 100,000 people. To give you some contrast, Japan has 0.07. In addition to deaths, the US has 80,000 firearm injuries every year and 500,000 gun crimes. That is a crime where a gun is fired or brandished. That's one every minute. No one knows how many guns are actually in private hands. It's illegal for the federal government to count them. But there are between 250 and 300 million guns in circulation if we can believe fairly consistent data that we get from public opinion polling. Now, of these guns, the 300 million guns, the overwhelming majority are possessed by law-abiding, totally responsible people, and they will never cause any harm. The problem is that that leaves plenty that are not. And we have a lot of gun crime. A couple of things to understand about gun crime. In 90% of crimes with guns, the firearm has changed hands more than once, meaning the original purchaser who went through the background check is not the perpetrator of that crime. Second, in about a third of the cases, the gun has crossed state lines, which, as we discussed earlier, is illegal. And third, virtually all gun crime, not the high-profile crimes like Sandy Hook, but virtually all gun crime is committed with handguns. And the most common age for gun crime, for gun criminals, is 19, followed by 20, followed by 18, followed by 17. And it is illegal for a licensed dealer to sell a handgun to anyone under 21. So if you take these facts together, what you find is that there is a vast interstate network of illegal gun traffickers who are moving guns in ways similar to illegal gun trade, drug trade, from states with relatively weak gun laws to states with tighter gun laws. And we know a lot about how these criminals and how these traffickers get their guns. They get them through theft. They get them through straw buyers, where they send in their girlfriend or somebody else to buy the gun for them. But they also get them in huge numbers from unlicensed sellers at gun shows and on the internet. So why can't we address this problem? Why can't we regulate guns more effectively? And here is where the story gets strange. There is no doubt that for some people, and maybe some of you, guns are a flashpoint in our politics that burns as brightly as any issue. There is a lot of heat and a lot of passion behind the gun debate. But it isn't exactly clear why or where all of this comes from. We've never really discovered the headwaters of the passion for guns in the United States. It could be America's frontier spirit. It could be a libertarian ethos. It could be the Second Amendment. We don't know. But whatever the source, many in this country have developed the belief that gun ownership is not just a right, but it is a sacred privilege. And that is a difficult place with which to argue. Now, there's about 100 million adults who live in a home with a gun. Sometimes they're the gun owner, sometimes they're the spouse. But according to polling, it's about 100 million people. They divide into three basic groups. There are people that own guns for sport, hunting, sport shooting. There's people that own guns for protection of their families, and there's people that own guns as a bulwark against government tyranny. The first two groups, those who own guns for sport and for protection, are, for the most part, overwhelmingly in favor of tightening gun laws and extending background checks. The third group is made up of what I call the constitutionalists. They're a distinct minority. They're by far the smallest of the three groups of gun owners, but they have come to control the entire gun debate. And they wield power that is massively out of proportion to their numbers. And of course, the main mechanism for the way that they wield that power is the NRA. The NRA is over 100 years old, and for much of its history, it was a staid, boring gun safety organization. I won an NRA safety patch at Camp Iroquois, not far from here. But I am old, and the NRA changed dramatically right around the time I was at Camp Iroquois. In 1977, the NRA had its annual meeting, and it was in Cincinnati, and it's since come to be called the Cincinnati Revolution. The old guard of the NRA, which believed in, sportsman promotion and protection of wetlands and doing things that some of the hook and bullet groups do now, was ousted by a new generation of gun rights absolutists led by their chief lobbyist, Wayne LaPierre, and a few others, a guy named Neil Knox. When they took over the NRA and the board of the NRA, they fired the people that had come before, and they turned the NRA into a reflection of what it has become, a behemoth who is at the forefront of the protection of gun rights in every instance. The NRA, just to give you a sense of it, has 3 magazines. One is kind of a technical magazine about guns. One is called American Rifleman, which is for sportsmen. And the third is called America's First Freedom, which is the Second Amendment in their view. And if you get America's First Freedom, you probably fall into the constitutionalist camp. LaPierre has run the NRA pretty much with an iron fist ever since. He is technically the executive vice president of the organization, but that doesn't mean anything. The president, which was Charlton Heston for a long time, is generally a figurehead. The current guy is a lawyer in Alabama who calls the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. They tend to be relatively conservative folks at the NRA, and LaPierre is in charge. The NRA in the last 40 years has kind of gone back and forth in its ebbed and flowed in its size and in its the level of its reach and power. Right now, they claim to have about 4.5 million members. Sometimes they go too far. In the 90s, George H.W. Bush, then former President Bush, quit the NRA publicly and angrily when LaPierre called federal agents jackbooted thugs wearing Nazi helmets and black stormtrooper uniforms. So they kind of walked back from that, and then they move kind of forward and back depending on the political winds. But they keep a tight grip on the gun industry and the gun movement. Just to give you a couple of examples. During the 90s, the Clinton administration arrived at a consent decree with Smith & Wesson because there were a lot of guns ending up in cities like Chicago. And Smith & Wesson agreed to do some very minor things to attempt to keep guns out of the hands of traffickers. The NRA immediately called for a boycott of Smith & Wesson. Smith & Wesson's sales fell by 40% overnight. They were taken private. Their leadership was fired. They abrogated the agreement and returned to their previous size. That was all the NRA. Just last week, a columnist, well-respected columnist for the magazine Guns and Ammo, was forced out after he wrote a column called "Let's Talk Limits. Do Certain Firearm Regulations Really Constitute an Infringement?" And he made clear, if you read this piece, that he is a Second Amendment true believer. But he was saying, look, is it unreasonable that we go through a 2-minute background check? I don't think so. That caused outrage among the constitutionalist crowd, and he was forced out of his job. And one final example is the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the trade association for the gun industry. And they have been completely adamantly opposed to any extension of background checks. And that wouldn't be surprising, except for 2 things. One is that they have a competitive disadvantage right now. Their members are gun dealers who have to run people through background checks, who are competing against unlicensed sellers who do not. So you would think that the trade association for the gun sellers would support extension of background checks. The other thing that's surprising about this opposition is that the headquarters of the National Shooting Sports Foundation is in Newtown, Connecticut, 3 miles from Sandy Hook Elementary School. So between the Sandy Hook shootings and the April gun debate in the Senate, Biden and Schumer were again kind of back in the saddle, working on guns, working overtime. Vice President was kind of working the outside game, giving speeches, going to Connecticut. Schumer was finding conservative Democrat and a conservative Republican to pair together to be the sponsors of the gun safety legislation that was going to come out, and he succeeded. On the eve of the debate in the Senate, he got Senator Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia with an A+ rating from the NRA, Senator Toomey, a conservative Republican from Pennsylvania with an A+ rating, who announced that they had a bill to close the internet and gun show loopholes. And the announcement of this bill helped overcome a filibuster of a procedural move to have a debate about it. And 16 Republicans voted with almost every Democrat to at least proceed to the debate, which was A huge surprise. Nothing like this had happened in 20 years. The Sandy Hook families were happy about that, but they weren't in Washington to win procedural votes. They wanted to win substantive votes. And unfortunately for us and for them, they fell 5 votes short. Of course, in the Senate, it's kind of an upside-down world. 5 votes short means they got 55 out of 100 votes, which in most places is enough, but not in the Senate where you need 60 to overcome filibusters. But the interesting thing is the public reaction to that vote was exactly the opposite of what most politicians would expect. The people who took strong stands voted for it in tough places. Mary Landrieu in Louisiana, Kay Hagan in North Carolina, saw their poll numbers go up immediately. The people who chickened out and voted against it in red states, like Jeff Flake in Arizona, saw his numbers go down by 20 points overnight. So in that dynamic, we think there is hope. These guys know that they did the wrong thing. The idea that strangers should be able to sell each other firearms without a background check strikes virtually everyone in the United States, 87% of the public, as nuts, particularly since we have a system where background checks can be completed in 2 minutes. And so when you have a senator like Jeff Flake who can't articulate a reason that he opposed this bill, also seeing his poll numbers go down as a result, we think that this may be a moment where we can make some progress again for the first time since 1994. But it's going to take a long time. Speaker Boehner made clear that he's not going to bring it up in this Congress, in his House. And it's worth noting that the only 2 times that major gun legislation has ever become law in Washington is when Democrats control the White House and both houses of Congress. So it may take until then. The families of Sandy Hook are still in the arena. This is despite the glare of a spotlight that forces them to tell their story over and over and over, the story of the darkest hour of their lives, the worst thing that can happen to you. This is going to come up again as the anniversary approaches, and you'll see them in the media. But they are willing to do that because they believe that they can be part of breaking this 20-year gridlock, and I hope and pray and expect that they're right. So with that, let me take questions or comments. Yes, sir.
You talked about the 3 different parts of the NRA and things like that. I would consider myself like a moderate Republican, but I also see how the tyranny of the government type thing, it sounds insane. It sounds insane, especially when you say it that way. But there is a real logic behind the fact that an armed populace it's a disincentive to things. And I'm not saying that the government is crazy trying to take away our rights, but no one knows what it would be like if it wasn't like this. And there's things that, like me as a moderate, I'm fine with background checks and things like that are reasonable. I'm willing to wait 2 minutes, etc. But there are other things like assault weapons bans and large capacity magazines, which I think are not really going to solve the problem and are not, I wouldn't do that because that's taking away, because if everybody's armed with a pistol, but the government, okay, I'd say but the government has assault rifles, that's an imbalance of power.
Well, that's not a very uncommon position. In fact, what happened in Colorado a few months ago is Colorado passed, in the wake of Sandy Hook, a very tough gun control law. And it included some bans on assault weapons and high-capacity clips. Bans are not popular, even though most gun safety measures are. For the reasons that you cite, bans aren't. It's 2 things. One is people just don't like the idea of things being banned. And the second thing is they're very skeptical that it would do any good because of what I talked about with the assault weapons ban. You can go on the internet right now and buy a 30-round clip for $12. There's a lot of them out there. And they would all be grandfathered if things were banned. So people just don't buy it that a ban is going to work. And so what happened in Colorado is that the NRA generated a recall petition against the leader of the Colorado State Senate and another state senator, and they both lost. And they lost not because the bill extended background checks to internet sales, which it did. They lost because of the bans. And people are worried about it both from the perspective you cited, which is maybe some of the constitutionalist concerns, but also because of its efficacy and because of it's just a ban. Yeah.
On the politics front, I formerly was a staff member for a Republican that voted in favor of the Brady bill, and so we experienced primary elections. And it seems that the fringe segment of, because the NRAs was one of the supporters of the primary efforts, so within the Republican Party, part of, I think, in my opinion anyways, why the Republican Party is in the position it's in is because it's pushed by this marginal group, this tiny group, because of primary elections. Is there any effort from more centrist groups or more nonpartisan groups to try and push more general party membership to participate in the primary process? Because there's that 18% turnout rate in a primary election that effect is so strong. And
that's exactly right. I am not an expert on what's going on in Republican politics, but I do know that there is a big effort underway by some of the donors to Republican politics, including Paul Singer, who's a hedge fund guy, and a guy named Dan Loeb, to fund moderate primary opponents, mostly on social, but also on economic grounds in some of these Republican House races, and very much hope that succeeds. Your old boss is getting to be a rare breed in Congress. There are not a lot of Republican moderates. There's very few voices inside the Republican caucus in either House or Senate that are saying, look, we've got to compromise on anything, much less on things as charged as guns. And what happens, and what we heard was, take Rob Portman. Rob Portman is a reasonable, moderate Republican senator from Ohio. He's a good, smart guy. He had come out the month before the bill came to the floor. He had come out and said that he is in favor of marriage equality for gays and lesbians. His son is gay. And Portman said to us, look, I'd like to support this. You're right, of course, but I can't. I can't take on two things at once, or I'll get a primary. Call it political cowardice, if you will, or call it realism, but he just felt like he couldn't do it. And so what we're really hoping is that there's going to be a change in that dynamic, but right now it's pretty strong. In the red and then green.
There has already been instances where people were able to successfully make their own homemade handguns and modifications like silencers using the new 3D printing technology. And this technology is rapidly expanding. It's not perfect yet, but it will be in the very near future. I don't see how this new technology can ever be regulated, or any bans could help stop spread these torrent files or these files that give you the blueprints for designs for various guns, and all people have to do is press file, print on a 3D printer, and share it with others. It'll be as easy as downloading music illegally. And I can't see it being effective. So I'm just wondering, has the policy debate on gun control caught up to this new technology and keeping it in mind?
It has. It's a great question. There's been 100,000 downloads of that plan in 2 days. And in fact, there is a law on the books right now that bans undetectable firearms, and plastic firearms fall into that category. They're dangerous for obvious reasons. If you've been to an airport, you know why. Most people do not want plastic guns making their way around. So they're illegal under current law, but believe it or not, that ban expires at the end of this year. And Senator Schumer is leading an effort to renew the ban, and Steve Israel, a congressman from Long Island, is got an effort in the House that would expand it to make sure that it includes downloadable plastic guns. It probably does, but it's antiquated language. Nobody knew of these things when it was first written. So the hope is that this bill will be renewed and strengthened a little bit. It is self-evidently necessary, but that is not by any means grounds for congressional action, as we've discovered. So we'll see.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us. My question is with regards to smart guns and childproof guns. I know that technology is currently moving around Europe to develop the technology is there to make it so that only the registered user of a gun is allowed to have it, so that the guns that are changing hands, like you said, are not ending up in the hands of people who should not have them. And I know that gun manufacturers have promised that by the end of the year that they'll start emerging within the markets in the United States, and that New Jersey is one of the forefront states that are saying that in 3 years that's going to be required, that only childproof guns are being sold. Do you see any movement on a federal level to enforce that as a standard for handguns especially, since those are the ones that are majority with the crime?
No. I don't think there's any way that that's going to happen anytime soon. A couple of reasons. One is we can't even extend the Brady Act. And that would be crawling compared to sprinting to do what you described. Second is there's 300 million guns in private hands already. So the fleet turnover rate in firearms is about 20 years. And so it's going to be, even if every gun tomorrow was sold with a safety device of that type, it would take 20 years to shake all those other guns out of the system, and perhaps much, much longer. There are a number of manufacturers who are working on it, and look, it would help. Adam Lanza's mother was a very responsible gun owner. She bought her guns in Connecticut. She went through training. She registered them under state law. Connecticut had tough gun laws, that has even tougher gun laws now. She complied with every one of them. She brought her son to the gun range to make sure that he understood gun safety. She did everything right. And he stole her guns, and she was his first victim. So had she had that technology available to her, the likelihood is she would have availed herself of it, and this wouldn't have happened. So it would help, but it is not likely to be helpful anytime soon. Yeah, over here.
Can you talk a little bit about the connection to mental illness and what efforts might actually work given the adjudication requirement and patient rates?
Yeah, this is really, really tough. When I was doing guns full time, we looked hard at whether it would be possible to change the 68 Act and expand in some way the mental health provisions. But you run into, my mother is here, and she is a mental health professional, and so is virtually everyone else in my family. The wall of opposition from the mental health community is immediate and steel. And for very good reasons. There's all kinds of privacy and stigma concerns about barring people from what is otherwise a right. Moreover, figuring out how you would define who is prohibited from owning a gun by virtue of mental health is virtually impossible. And in some cases, with some high-profile gun massacres, it would have worked. The person who massacred 33 people at Virginia Tech, Sung Ho Ching, should have been in the system. He had been adjudicated mentally ill. He had been involuntarily committed, but he wasn't because the data in Virginia was bad, and he was able to buy a gun at a gun store as a result. So the only thing I can think of to do is to make sure the data gets in the system, to make sure that mental health institutions, many of whom keep their own records and need to feed those into the system, get that patient privacy is protected, that this is important to do. But beyond that, expanding the category would be very hard.
I've always been a gun advocate. I've always been around that. But my question to you is, I know there's been a lot of problems. A lot of people say that firearms are bad, when really, if they're in the right hands, they're tools. A lot of people state that supposedly assault rifles are different than regular rifles. There's no difference. There's a piece of plastic on them that supposedly changes it. Why do you think that attachments, collapsible stocks, pistol grips, things like this sort of change the weapon, when really it's the same round that comes out of the gun? It shoots just as fast as any other gun. It's just as lethal as any other gun. But people seem to have this stigma that these guns are different, when they're really not. It's just things on them. They're pieces of plastic.
So first, let me state for the record that I agree with your fundamental point. And from the beginning, my organization, Americans for Gun Safety, was pushing the gun safety community to embrace the idea that the Second Amendment applies in the United States. Whether it was de jure, and it was unclear before the Supreme Court decided this in 2006, or de facto, there are 300 million guns in private hands. And that is not going to change. So whether you like it or not, you like it, you don't, it's a fact. And I agree wholeheartedly that if you are a responsible gun owner, nothing bad will come of your ownership of guns. Only good things will come. The gun culture is incredibly rich and important for a huge segment of this population. And people like me really need to understand that, and many of them don't. So I agree. On the point about assault weapons, I largely agree that they are not vastly different. Because most firearms now are semi-automatic. That wasn't always the case. It wasn't the case in the 1990s, but it is now. There isn't much substantive difference between an assault weapon and a regular rifle or any kind of semi-auto. There is a psychological difference. They look scary. And that may not sound like anything to somebody who is familiar with and comfortable with guns and who knows a lot of responsible people who own guns. But most people in the United States, the majority, don't. They don't know from guns. They don't have any training. They aren't around them. And so there is an emotional connection to the assault weapons ban that goes back to the 90s and that is triggered every time one of these huge massacres at the Navy Yard, in Aurora, at Virginia Tech, and in Newtown happen, because virtually every time they involve an assault weapon. So I think on the merits, if I were king of the world, I would say, look, the assault weapons ban doesn't make any sense for some of the reasons you cite and because it just doesn't really work. But there is a big swath of the public that believes it's important.
My name's Anthony. I just had a question for I have a 4-year-old son, so after seeing him, I can appreciate the loss. I can't imagine something like that happened to my son. Then again, my father was 23 years military. Before that, he was a cop. My brother-in-law was a cop. I served in the military. I served in Iraq. And coming home from there, all my life I've shot guns. I'm from Florida. The first time I shot a gun, I was probably 4 years old. So my son, when he turned 4, I took him. We went and bought him a Ruger 1022, and I took him to a range and taught him how to shoot it. And it was probably I'll probably never forget it, and hopefully neither will he. And so moving on, I own an AR-15, and in New York State, you mentioned that nothing bad, if you're a responsible gun owner, nothing bad will come, to you. But I kind of disagree because of the fact that, given my history, I've never been in trouble. I've never, I've definitely sped, so I've broken laws for sure. But
we'll forgive you for that.
Thanks. But the reality of it now is, if I do not register that rifle, April of next year, if they found out about it, if I was driving to the range to shoot, that would be a felony.
Yeah, you'd be in trouble.
And I just think that where's the justification for someone who, I'm a dad, I'm a veteran, right. I'm a student. So where's the justification for, hey, let's ruin this kid's life and throw a felony charge on his record.
So let me be clear, that's a state law. That is a New York state law. And when I was saying, if you're a responsible gun owner, nothing bad will come to you, I was referring to an extension of federal law that would require background checks at internet and gun shows.
Which I agree with.
Yeah, and I'm sure you do, because virtually everybody like you, responsible gun owners who know what they're doing and are doing the right thing, does. I don't really want to get into a debate about the New York State law. I think there's elements of the law that go too far. I think some of it's going to be struck down. I think it's pretty plainly unconstitutional under DC versus Heller. It's complicated. But on the merits, I think you're right. If you're a responsible gun owner, you shouldn't be in trouble if you're doing the right thing. And look, a lot of people teach their kids to shoot when they're very young and believe quite strongly, and they are probably right, that is the best way to ensure that they have a respect for firearms and that they treat them properly. So there is nothing wrong with any of that, and one of the messages that I try to bring to non-gun owners is that they have to understand that even that folks who own firearms may do things differently, but if they act responsibly, there is absolutely no problem, and that they are not the problem. One thing the NRA gets right is that much of the time, gun control advocates tar gun owners with a very broad brush. Responsible gun owners who keep their guns safely are not the problem. The problem is the people who are engaged in illegal trafficking of guns and gun criminals.
One of the things that seems so starkly different and scary, I think, is it's hard to understand for non-gun owners is some of the data you hear about other countries, or at least the context of the number of deaths we have here or crimes versus other countries. But then from the other side, you'll sometimes hear that, well, in other countries there is violent crime. It just may not involve a gun. I was wondering if you have any information about the realities of that.
It just can't be denied. We have way, way more gun deaths than other industrialized countries. Now, there are more dangerous countries. As a per capita basis, you don't want to be in Guatemala. But that isn't because there are so many guns in private hands, it's because of other problems in Guatemala. But just to give you an example, I cited the number of Japan, which is 0.07 per 10,000 gun deaths. But Japan has virtually no guns in private hands, so that's not fair. Let's look at Switzerland. In Switzerland, virtually every single home has a gun in it because they have a well-regulated militia. Everybody in Switzerland's in the military for the most part, and they keep their gun in their home. 3 gun deaths per 100,000 versus our 10. Canada has a gun ownership rate of about 70%. Now, virtually all Canadian gun owners own long guns for sport. There's very few handguns in Canada. 1 firearm death per 100,000. So there is a correlation between the number of guns in private hands and the level of gun violence in the United States. It is simply a fact. And the people, kind of fake academics who pretend otherwise, are just wrong. And it's been proven over and over and over. Any final questions?
How do you recommend reconciling the state to state? Like you mentioned in Pennsylvania, here we are in New York State with stricter laws.
How do you propose reconciling that interstate issue with these laws and the differences?
Well, they can't really be reconciled, but there are some things that can happen. First of all, states can be more responsible. My state of Virginia for many years was totally irresponsible. They had virtually no gun laws, and what would happen is that criminals would come to Virginia, load up on a bunch of guns, and bring them to Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York City, Boston. The NYPD did sting operations in gun stores in Virginia where they went in and used straw buyers and hidden cameras. And Virginia responded by passing a law outlawing that, outlawing the NYPD from coming to Virginia. So states could get their act together. The other thing that could be done, and one of the principal policy things that we're pushing, is the federal government can do a better job of really focusing on interstate gun trafficking. Only they are really equipped to do it. It is obviously a federal responsibility. And we know how guns move in interstate commerce because when a gun is traced, when they're used in crime, we can tell who the original gun store was. And guns move in interstate commerce in very predictable ways. They move from Florida and the I-95 corridor to the Northeast corridor. They move from Mississippi and Louisiana to Chicago. They move from Texas to California. We know that. And ATF needs more money, more personnel to inspect gun stores. As I said, 59,000 gun dealers, like 25 ATF agents who do these inspections. And we need the FBI and others to do a better job of cracking down on trafficking.
I think a lot of the opposition to gun regulation comes from the arbitrary nature of many of the laws. And I have an example. Like New York, I didn't want to get into it, but it's something you probably apply to other laws about guns too. Like for instance, in 2011, more people were killed in New York with hands, fists, and feet than rifles and shotguns combined. And I think 7 people were killed with rifles that year in violent crime.
Thanks. And my question would be, why does you say it's irresponsible to have no gun laws, which we can all agree with that, but would you also say it is just as irresponsible to have gun laws that don't reflect the level of crime being used with a particular type of gun? Because the New York State law that was just passed comes down just as heavily on shotguns and rifles as it does on pistols, and there's almost, like in comparison, there's a lot more pistol crime than a lot of the other two.
That's right. That's certainly right, and it may be. I will say that Justice Ginsburg had a great line in an unrelated case recently where she said, taking away this kind of law when it's working is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. It may be that there is a correlation between tough New York gun laws and a relatively low rate of gun crime in New York, despite the fact that a lot of guns are brought in from out of state. There are pretty good laws. It's enforced. In New York City, if you're caught with a gun and you're a felon, you're going away for real time. So there are some obvious and verifiable benefits to having tougher gun laws. That said, I think that the New York law was written in haste, and I think that you may be right that it's overbroad and it shouldn't apply to certain kinds of firearms. I am not an expert in this law, and so I'm not ducking, I just don't know, frankly. So.
This is the last question for me, but Adam Lanza committed an upwards of 41 crimes. Most of them were felonies.
Right.
Why do you feel that one more crime that says you can't have him is going to stop him from committing the other 41? Because he had already committed the 41. Why would one more stop him? If anything, he would just jump over it.
So which is the one more you're saying? And I'm
adding anything, stopping gun more. Like you can't.
You're correct, and I think if I wasn't clear, let me be. It wasn't possible to stop Adam Lanza with any of the kind of gun control measures that anyone's talking about. Adam Lanza stole his guns from his mother. It's very, very difficult to stop that kind of thing. What I was saying about the Sandy Hook families is that they were willing to set aside the particular details of their own tragedy, despite the fact that they believe in their hearts that if there had been a ban on magazines, some of their kids might have lived. Despite that, they were willing to set that aside, really pay no attention to the details of Lanza's murders, and focus instead on the things that we know would help cut down on gun crime, like expanding background checks. So I think you're probably right that one more law wouldn't have stopped Adam Lanza, but one more law might well stop any of the 31 gun murders that occur every day.
Can we agree that this problem is not going to be solved, but can be reduced?
For sure.
But the language on the other side is often, this won't solve the problem.
Right.
That won't solve the problem. Well, nothing's going to solve the problem because in the United States we have a frontier mentality and we operate out of fear. Just the other day, an African-American woman, ran out of gas, rang a doorbell, and was shot in the head. Fear.
Sometimes it's fear. I want to just go back to a point I raised earlier. So yes, of course, that's right. We can never solve the problem. 19,000 of our gun deaths are suicides. But we can reduce gun violence. And I want to just make a pitch for those of us in the community of people that don't own guns, is to understand it isn't just fear. In some cases, that is certainly the case. But there is a rich, deep, important, and salutary gun culture in this country that, passed down from parents to children, and we have to be respectful of that. And very often, I think, some of the heat in the gun debate is generated by a feeling that one side believes the other thinks they're stupid. This goes both ways, but we have to be very careful to ensure that that isn't how we're approaching this question.
Do you think these state and federal laws that's really tight and strict on the sales and background check, all that stuff, really backfiring on the circulation of new guns into the market? Because shortly after Newtown shooting, the gun sales skyrocketed. Yeah. And just after Obama was elected president, the gun sales skyrocketed because everyone's fearing he's gonna sign new laws tightening the gun sales. So my question is, do you think these laws are like backfiring?
Nope.
Really just
because the vast majority of those gun sales were not problematic. Those are people that went to gun stores, they went through background checks, they are law-abiding adults. It doesn't bother me when gun sales go up. I think it's notable that they went up after Obama because there is some irrational fear that Obama was going to go take away people's guns, which is preposterous. But that isn't a problem. The problem is the unregulated market that allows people to sell guns to each other, stranger to stranger, without a background check. That's the problem. And if we can stop that, then we can have a real impact on guns. Gun sales from licensed gun dealers that are lawful are not a problem, particularly in a moment when we have 300 million guns already in private hands. Another 800,000 is going to have only a marginal impact. I think we have time for one more.
So my question is, you're talking about needing to cut down on these unregulated gun sales, and you're talking about how these people, you've seen them sell to people who are just obvious members of gangs and the Taliban and all these different examples where it's very obvious that what they're doing is causing harm. What makes you think that if we were to bring in harsher penalties or to force background checks, that people would actually follow them if they already should? They don't really have very much compassion towards the outcome of their choices.
Well, because of my belief that in the unregulated private market, the majority of sellers are wanting to be reasonable and responsible. And for those who are not, they would be worried that they could end up in prison if they execute a sale to an undercover agent, or they sell a gun to somebody who uses it in a crime and it's traced to them. So with penalties and with responsible citizens given the opportunity to run background checks, right now they can't even do it. There's no way, if you wanted to sell your gun to him and you didn't know each other, there was no way for you to do that with a background check because there's no mechanism under the law to get that done. So we want to give people the opportunity to run background checks. Nobody in this nation, with the exception of only crazy people, and there may be none of them, wants to sell their gun to Al-Qaeda. Virtually nobody wants to sell their gun to a criminal or to a gun trafficker. So we have to set up a mechanism to make sure that they're not. And that's why I think it would work. All right, with that, I better shut up, and thank you all very much.